Voiceover 4 Millionaire in Love. He built his empire by never looking back, until the woman he once loved called after 5 years of silence, asking him to meet her at a hospital. What secret could she be hiding? She brought a little girl in a wheelchair with eyes just like his. Henry didn't speak at first. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what his eyes and heart had already understood. The little girl in the wheelchair, Lily, had his eyes, his cheekbones, and the same way of tilting her head when she was curious. Sky stood between them like a bridge between two versions of his life, past and present, her hands gently resting on the back of the chair. She looked thinner than he remembered, and tired, not just from the day, but from something deeper and more enduring. "I didn't know how else to do this," she said, her voice low and steady. Though Henry could see she was holding herself together with effort. "I didn't plan to tell you like this or even to reach out at all. But I had no choice." She gestured to the hallway behind her. "She's been through so much already last year. She had an accident at the playground. Fell from a climbing structure, landed wrong. Spinal trauma. The doctors say there's a chance she could walk again, but the surgery is expensive. Too expensive, and insurance barely covers anything." Could this change everything for Henry? Henry glanced at Lily, who was now looking down at her hands, quietly humming to herself and swinging a little plush bunny in her lap. She didn't seem to notice the weight of the moment hanging over the adults beside her. Or maybe she was used to it. Maybe she'd learned how to carry it without making others feel it. He shifted his gaze back to Sky, his voice coming out quieter than he expected. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't I know about her?" Sky hesitated, exhaling slowly, as if bracing herself for the answer she had practiced, but never said aloud. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "When I found out I was pregnant, we had just broken up. You were already disappearing into your career, and I didn't think you'd want this life. I didn't want to be a burden or a distraction from what you were chasing. And later, it just seemed easier to raise her on my own than to risk being rejected." She looked down at Lily, then back at him. "But now it's not about pride. It's not about fear. It's about her, and she needs help." Henry felt something shift in his chest. Guilt, grief, something too large to name. He looked again at the child who had existed 5 full years without his knowledge. How many birthdays had he missed? First steps, first words. How much had she needed him when he hadn't even known she existed? He crouched slightly, bringing himself to Lily's level, careful not to scare her. "Hi," he said gently. "I'm Henry." She looked at him, blinked, and smiled. "Hi, you talk like me," she said matter-of-factly, as if that was the most important thing to notice. Her voice was soft but confident, her smile wide. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Before Henry could answer, Sky's voice cut in tender and honest. "He's more than that, baby." Henry stood again, running a hand through his hair, heart pounding in his chest. The walls of the hospital suddenly felt too narrow. "Tell me everything," he said to Sky. "What the doctor said, what it costs, what she needs." Sky nodded, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly for the first time since he arrived. "I have it all. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Henry. I just didn't know where else to turn." "You don't have to ask," he said, his tone more certain now. "You won't do this alone." Sky looked at him then, not with doubt, but with a kind of guarded hope, and something unspoken passed between them. They had once shared something powerful, something unfinished. And now, standing in front of the little girl who unknowingly carried both their reflections, it was clear their story wasn't over. It had only just changed shape. Sky led him to a quiet bench near the hospital's courtyard, a small space with worn benches and a few tired trees, where the noise of machines and intercoms faded slightly. Henry followed in silence, his thoughts tangled in a way he wasn't used to. He was a man who dealt in logic with years of hard facts and quick decisions behind him, but nothing about this moment fit into any category he understood. When they sat, Lily remained beside them in her wheelchair, now distracted by a butterfly that had landed on the armrest, humming a soft tune as if none of the tension around her existed. Sky folded her hands tightly as though holding herself together by sheer will, and glanced sideways at him. She didn't rush her words. After we broke up, I didn't expect to find out I was pregnant. I wasn't planning to contact you because I thought it would make things worse for both of us. You were on the edge of something big. I'd seen it. You were changing, moving toward a life that didn't include people like me. I didn't want to be the reason you slowed down or worse looked back. Henry didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on the child next to them, the child who had his exact shade of blue in her eyes and the same dimple that appeared when she smiled. Skye continued, her voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of years of silence. I tried to do it on my own. For the most part, we were okay. Lily is a strong girl, smart, kind. She never complains, never even cried much when she was little. But then last year happened. She was at a friend's birthday party, fell off one of those climbing structures. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a bruise. Then she couldn't feel her legs. She paused, the memory clearly hitting her hard, but she refused to let it break her voice. We went through a dozen specialists. They all said the same thing. Incomplete spinal trauma. Not irreversible, but delicate, risky, and incredibly expensive. The best shot she has is a procedure being offered at a private pediatric center across the state. The surgery, the rehab, everything together, over $400,000. Henry didn't flinch at the number. He could have transferred that amount in the time it took her to finish the sentence. What stunned him wasn't the cost. It was the fact that she had carried all this alone. That she had come to him only when the weight became too great to bear. Why didn't you try to find me sooner? He asked quietly, not accusing, but genuinely needing to understand. I didn't want your money, Skye said. And I didn't want pity. I wanted to protect her. I didn't want her to grow up thinking she was someone's accident or obligation. If I was wrong, if you said you didn't want anything to do with her, I wouldn't have survived watching her realize that. Henry exhaled slowly. The hospital, the courtyard, the questions, all of it pressed in on him, but nothing compared to the ache building behind his ribs. He looked at Lily again, who was now softly singing to herself, swinging her plush bunny by one ear. You weren't wrong, he said, his voice low, almost rough, about me changing, about leaving, but I was wrong about what mattered. Skye turned her head toward him, surprised by the confession. He met her gaze. I can't undo what I missed. I can't take back 5 years. But I can be here now. I want to be. Skye's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away quickly, wiping them before Lily could notice. She nodded slowly, not ready to fully believe it yet, but no longer running from the possibility. She doesn't know who you are, she said gently. Not yet. I told her a story once about her dad. I told her he was smart and strong and kind when it counted. She asked if he was real. I said yes, even though I didn't know if he still existed. Henry reached over and placed a hand lightly on the armrest of Lily's wheelchair. He didn't touch her, didn't want to scare her, but the gesture said what his voice couldn't yet express. He does, he said quietly. I just forgot how to be him. And in the stillness of that moment, with the spring breeze moving through the trees and the child between them, unaware of how much she had already changed their lives, something old broke apart, and something new, fragile, but full of promise, began to take its place. Henry spent the next 24 hours in a state of quiet motion. His body moved through the necessary steps, emails to his assistant canceling all meetings for the week, phone calls to specialists whose names Skye had scribbled on a notepad, conversations with hospital administrators about transfer protocols and insurance coverage. But his mind was elsewhere, caught between the girl he couldn't stop looking at and the woman he'd once loved, who had quietly carried the weight of both their choices. By the time he returned to the hospital the next day, he had arranged for Lily to be transferred to a private pediatric rehabilitation center known for its advanced surgical options in post-operative therapy. He'd spoken directly with the head of the surgical team, who agreed to prioritize her case. Money wasn't an issue. Time was. Skye met him in the waiting area, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and cautious gratitude. She hadn't asked for this, and he hadn't offered it as charity. There was an understanding between them now, unspoken, but deeply felt. They were no longer strangers with history. They were parents. As the nurse rolled Lily out in her chair, holding a small backpack in her lap and her bunny tucked under one arm, she smiled at Henry without hesitation. "Are we going to the place with the big windows?" she asked. Skye had clearly told her just enough to keep her calm without overwhelming her. Henry nodded and crouched beside her. "We are, and I'll be there, too, if that's okay with you." She looked at him for a long moment, as if testing the shape of that promise, then nodded. "Okay, but you have to sit by the window. I get car sick." Her straightforwardness made him laugh quietly, and something about her tone reminded him so much of himself, it startled him. The drive to the facility was quiet. Lily dozed in the back seat, the gentle rhythm of the road and the soft hum of the engine lulling her to sleep. Skye sat beside her, glancing back every few minutes with the practiced movements of someone who had long learned to watch for signs of pain without drawing attention to it. Henry drove with a calmness he hadn't felt in years. He was used to urgency, to pressure, to making moves in minutes that affected entire regions of his business empire. But this felt different. He wasn't managing a crisis. He was holding something delicate, something human. When they arrived, the medical staff greeted them quickly, escorting Lily inside for preliminary evaluations while Skye handled paperwork. Henry remained at her side the entire time, reading forms, asking questions, insisting on the best care without needing to raise his voice. Once Lily was settled in her room, which had a view of the gardens below, Skye sat on the windowsill and finally allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't cried in front of him yet, and she didn't now, but her silence was heavy with all the things she hadn't had time to feel. Henry offered her a bottle of water and stood beside her, unsure of whether to speak or wait. She broke the silence first. "I haven't felt this kind of fear since the night she fell. Back then, I thought I was holding my breath for a few hours, maybe a few days. I didn't know it would stretch into a year." Henry nodded, not pretending to understand fully, but willing to listen. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone," he said quietly. "I should have been there for both of you." Skye gave him a sideways glance, not filled with blame, but with a tired sort of honesty. "You weren't. But you're here now, and that matters more than I thought it would." Neither of them said much more after that. Instead, they stayed by the window, watching Lily sleep peacefully in a room that felt safer than the world had in a long time. That night, Henry checked into a hotel 5 minutes from the facility. He didn't go back to his penthouse, to the cold expanse of glass and silence that once defined his life. He wanted to be nearby, ready. He wasn't sure what he was yet to Lily. Maybe a stranger with a promise. Maybe a father in waiting. But he knew he wanted to earn his place. Not with words, with presence. And so he stayed close in case she needed him. In case Skye did too, in case this was the beginning of something real. The following days settled into a strange but steady rhythm. Henry visited the rehabilitation center every morning before the official workday would normally begin, arriving with coffee for Skye and something small for Lily, a coloring book, a puzzle, a packet of stickers shaped like stars. He was careful never to overwhelm or intrude, always letting Lily guide the pace of their connection. At first, she treated him like a friendly visitor, someone interesting but not essential. But slowly, day by day, something shifted. She began to look for him at the door before he even entered, her face lighting up whenever he appeared. She asked him questions, invited him into her playtime, and eventually, without any prompting, started calling him Henry in a way that held no distance at all. Henry found himself looking forward to every visit more than anything else in his world. His assistant, confused by his continued absence from the office, had tried to rearrange meetings, push back deadlines, and even offered to send a company jet if needed. But Henry responded with something his team had never heard from him before. "Handle it. I'm busy with something more important." It was the truth. For the first time in years, his life had meaning beyond control and profit. His priority had a name and a face, and she was learning to smile again. Lily's doctors were cautiously optimistic. The surgery had gone well, and she had begun responding to therapy with small signs of regained sensation in her legs. She still couldn't walk, but her therapists believed in her progress. The sessions were hard emotionally and physically, but she didn't complain. Henry watched from the observation room as she struggled through balance exercises and painful stretches. Sweat clinging to her forehead, eyes focused, jaw set with quiet determination. He sought his own intensity in her, not born of pressure, but of will. She had the fire of someone who had never been handed anything easily and still refused to give up. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in her room, Lily asked him if he had any children. The question caught him off guard, and for a heartbeat he didn't know how to answer. He sat beside her and said carefully, "I didn't know I had a child until I met you. But now I do. I have you." She looked at him for a long time, not with confusion, but with the seriousness only children could carry when the world didn't quite make sense. "Does that mean you're my dad?" she asked. Her voice wasn't afraid, just curious, like she was trying to draw the line from one point to another. Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "If you want me to be, I'd like to be Lily." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to her drawing, adding another flower to the page in front of her. Then, in the quietest voice he had ever heard her use, she said, "Okay, that was it." No dramatic moment, no music playing in the background, just a quiet acceptance between two people who had been strangers and were now beginning something new. Later that evening, Henry found Skye outside on the bench near the garden, her coat wrapped tightly around her as the air turned cool. She looked at him, her face unreadable for a moment, then finally softened. "She told me what you said, that you want to be her dad." He nodded. "I meant it." Skye stared out at the horizon for a while before speaking again. "I never thought we'd be standing in this place. Not just physically, but emotionally. Everything I thought was gone came rushing back the moment I saw you with her." Henry didn't ask what she meant. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply sat beside her and listened. That night, they didn't talk about the past. They talked about Lily's school preferences, her favorite cereal, the fact that she'd started asking for dance lessons once she could walk again. It was the kind of conversation parents had, full of the mundane details that carried enormous meaning when life had once been uncertain. And when Skye leaned her head gently on his shoulder, neither of them moved away. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. By the 5th week of Lily's rehabilitation, something in the air had changed. The walls of the pediatric center no longer felt like a place where emergencies lived, but more like a second home, a space of hope and quiet effort. Henry now knew the names of the nurses and the therapists. He knew which elevator had the softest ride that wouldn't jostle Lily too much. He knew that she liked apple slices with cinnamon before therapy and that she hated when people called her brave just for smiling. He also knew that he had never been more proud of another human being in his life. Lily's progress, though incremental, was measurable. She could now stand for several seconds with support. She had begun taking tiny assisted steps with parallel bars, her arms trembling as they held her weight. Each time she pushed herself forward, she looked around the room, and if Henry was there, she would smile like she was doing it for both of them. He kept his distance during sessions, never interfering, but always there. He had learned that sometimes love meant simply being in the room. It was not about fixing. It was about staying. Skye had changed too. In the early days, her posture had been tense, her voice soft from fatigue. Now she carried herself with steadier confidence. Her laughter came more easily, especially when Lily insisted on singing entire songs mid-therapy to distract herself from the pain. She and Henry had started sharing morning coffee on the hospital patio, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. One day, she brought him a scarf because she said he always forgot to dress for the wind. It was such a small gesture, but when she looped it around his neck herself, it felt more intimate than anything they had shared in years. Henry's business world, meanwhile, had adapted to his new rhythm. His team had stopped asking when he would return to full capacity. The truth was he had no intention of returning to that life, not in the way he had known it. Deals and deadlines no longer seemed urgent. What felt urgent was being there when Lily reached for his hand. What felt essential was learning how to braid hair, even if his fingers fumbled, or figuring out how to turn her hospital room into a place filled with color and light and music. One evening, just after dinner, Henry arrived with a surprise. It was a pair of shoes, small, white, simple shoes that could only be worn by someone who would walk in them. Lily gasped when she opened the box, her fingers tracing the curves of the soles like they were made of gold. "Are they really mine?" she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Henry knelt in front of her, helping her slip them on. "They're yours for whenever you're ready. I believe you'll walk in them." Skye watched from the doorway, one hand over her mouth. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were glassy, her expression soft. After Lily had gone to bed, exhausted but glowing, Skye met Henry in the hallway. "You know," she said. She used to talk about her future like it was a storybook, as if all the good parts were meant for other people. "Not anymore." Henry didn't respond right away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn photo he had found just the night before. It was of Skye taken years ago, smiling wide with wind-blown hair and holding a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. "I missed all the beginnings," he said. "But I won't miss the rest." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of time between them slowly giving way to something lighter. And then gently she took his hand. It wasn't a promise. Not yet. But it was something real. And for both of them, that was more than enough. The sixth chapter of their story began quietly without announcement or fanfare. But the shift was undeniable. Lily was no longer simply progressing in her recovery. She was transforming. Her body, which had once struggled to respond to even the gentlest movements, was now cooperating in ways that stunned even her doctors. She had reached the point where she could walk 5 full steps with a walker, her legs trembling beneath her, but holding. And each time she moved forward, her face lit up, not with pride, but with joy, as if the world had returned to her one small miracle at a time. Henry had started staying longer, sometimes from morning through the late afternoon, working from his laptop in a corner of the therapy room or on the patio outside Lily's window. His life no longer felt like it was split between work and something else. It was all one life now, whole and deeply rooted in something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He took part in everything from therapy check-ins to parent support groups to weekend art sessions where Lily painted everything in shades of pink and gold. Other parents noticed, sometimes staring a little too long, as if trying to place him. To most, he looked like a man from a different world with tailored clothes and sharp features and a presence that was difficult to ignore. But here, he was just Lily's dad. And the longer he stayed, the more he felt like he had always been. Skye had slowly let go of her cautious distance. She and Henry no longer tiptoed around each other in conversations or avoided difficult subjects. They spoke openly now about the past, about the ways they'd both changed, and about the cracks that had formed between them all those years ago. One rainy afternoon, they sat in the hospital cafe while Lily napped upstairs, and Skye admitted, "I was angry at you for a long time. But the truth is, I never gave you the chance to know. I assumed you wouldn't care. And maybe back then that was fair. But now, you're not the man I remember. And I'm not the woman who left." Henry didn't argue. He simply reached for her hand, holding it lightly, not to convince her, but to say without words that he was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as the sky turned to soft blue-gray and the city lights began to flicker awake, Lily called them both into her room. She was sitting up, her walker by her side, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice trembling with anticipation. They stood beside her, watching as she gripped the handles of the walker and pulled herself to her feet. Without hesitation, she took 7 steps, slow but steady, crossing the room without falling. She didn't look down. She looked only at them. When she reached the other side, she smiled and said, "See, I told you I'd get there." Skye cried then openly, her hand pressed to her heart as she knelt beside her daughter. Henry felt his throat tighten, unable to speak, overwhelmed by pride and awe and something deeper he hadn't known he was missing until now. That night, after Lily was asleep, Skye stood beside Henry outside on the terrace, her arms wrapped around herself against the breeze. "You gave her something I couldn't," she said softly. "You made her believe she could do more than just hope." Henry shook his head. "She did that on her own. I just stood close enough to witness it." Skye looked up at him, her expression no longer guarded. "I think we're not just getting Lily back," she said. "I think we're getting ourselves back, too." And for the first time in a long time, there was no more pretending, no more waiting. There was only this, an imperfect but healing family, choosing each other day after day. Not because they had to, because they finally could. Spring had fully arrived by the time Lily took her first unassisted steps outside. The garden at the rehabilitation center was blooming with pale yellow tulips and soft green leaves, and the air carried the warmth of a season determined to soften everything winter had left behind. Henry stood just a few feet away from her, watching as she moved carefully across the paved path, arms out slightly for balance. Each step was cautious but certain, and she wore the same pair of white shoes he had given her weeks earlier. She didn't look down. She looked at the trees, the sky, the world opening in front of her again. Skye was seated nearby on a wooden bench, holding her breath without realizing it, her eyes never leaving Lily's small frame. When Lily reached the end of the path, she turned around and beamed at them both. "I walked all the way," she said, as if they hadn't been watching every second. Henry and Skye clapped, laughed, and walked to her without hesitation. Skye scooped her up and spun her carefully, tears forming in her eyes. Henry knelt beside them, his hand on Lily's back, not saying anything because words felt too small for what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just progress. It was possibility returning to her eyes. Later that day, back in her room, Lily was drawing while Henry and Skye sat across from each other by the window. The air between them was different now, warmer, more open. Henry had noticed that Skye's laugh came easier these days, and she no longer glanced at the clock every few minutes like she had in the beginning. She had stopped looking for escape routes. She was starting to stay, not just in body, but in spirit. Skye reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "There's something I want you to read," she said, sliding it across the table. Henry hesitated, then picked it up and opened it carefully. It was a letter she had written to him but never sent. The date in the corner was just 2 months after Lily was born. In it, she told him about the day their daughter first smiled, the sound of her laugh, how she slept with one hand curled beside her cheek. She wrote about being scared, about missing him, and about choosing not to send the letter because she didn't want to risk breaking again if he didn't answer. Henry finished reading and looked up at her, the paper still trembling slightly in his hands. "You kept this?" he asked. "All this time?" Skye nodded. "I guess part of me always hoped I'd have a reason to give it to you someday." There was silence, then a kind of peace that settled over the room. Henry folded the letter slowly and placed it in his jacket pocket. "This means more to me than you'll ever know," he said. That night, Skye and Henry took Lily for a walk through the garden again, this time hand in hand. Lily skipped ahead occasionally, her steps light and joyful, calling out the names of flowers she'd memorized. Skye looped her arm through Henry's without thinking. He didn't look surprised. He just held on. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the garden path, Henry felt a sense of stillness he hadn't known in years. Not the empty kind he used to chase in silence and solitude, but the full kind, the kind that comes when every piece of your life, even the broken ones, finally has a place to belong. He didn't need to ask what came next. He already knew. They weren't waiting for life to start anymore. They were already living it one step, one moment, one shared smile at a time. The final chapter of their journey didn't come with a dramatic finish or some grand announcement, but with quiet, meaningful shifts that turned routine into something sacred. 3 months had passed since Lily's final therapy session, and her last day at the rehabilitation center was more celebration than goodbye. Staff lined the hallways with paper flowers and posters of encouragement. And Lily, walking unassisted in her favorite white shoes and a light pink dress, waved like a queen returning to her kingdom. She didn't need a walker anymore. She still got tired, and some days were harder than others, but her steps were hers now. Every single one of them. Henry stood just outside the double doors, holding a bouquet of spring tulips in one hand and a soft blue backpack in the other. Skye stood beside him, smiling through quiet tears, her hand wrapped around his. When Lily reached them, she wrapped her arms around both their waists without a word, just holding on. They didn't need to say anything. They knew what they had overcome, what they had built. They had lived each moment fully. And now they were stepping into the next one with nothing left unspoken between them. That evening they didn't return to a hospital suite or a hotel. They went home, Henry's home, which didn't feel cold or hollow anymore. The rooms were no longer quiet, the walls no longer bare. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator and little shoes by the front door. A bookshelf in the living room now held both finance textbooks and children's storybooks. It wasn't just a home he had filled for Lily. It was one he had created for all of them. Dinner was simple, pasta and salad and fresh bread, but it felt like a feast. They laughed, passed plates, and shared stories. Afterward, Lily insisted they all sit on the floor in the living room for a family movie night, a tradition they had started at the hospital with a tablet and a stack of pillows. Now, it took place on a big rug with a projector on the wall, and Lily curled between them with her stuffed bunny tucked under one arm and a bowl of popcorn balanced on her lap. At one point during the film, she looked up at them, her eyes sleepy but content, and said, "This is what I wanted the whole time." Neither of them asked what she meant. They knew. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Skye and Henry stepped outside onto the porch. The stars were out, scattered across a sky that felt unusually close. Skye leaned into him and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They had stopped talking about the future in terms of what-ifs. Now they talked about schools, summer vacations, weekend plans. Not everything was perfect, but it didn't need to be. They had earned this peace, this slowness, this love that came not from fantasy, but from choosing each other over and over again. Henry thought back to the man he had been just a few months before. A man who thought love was weakness, who kept people at a distance, who mistook success for fulfillment. That version of him had vanished the day he saw a little girl in a wheelchair beside the only woman he had ever truly loved. From that moment on, his life had stopped being a fortress and started becoming a home. And every step Lily took, every glance Skye shared with him, had stitched together a life he never dared to imagine. As the wind rustled the trees and the porch light hummed gently above them, Skye looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for finding us." He didn't answer right away. He just kissed her forehead and replied, "You didn't need to be found. You were always mine. I just had to be ready to come home." And under that soft sky, with love wrapped around them like something they'd never again take for granted, they stood still and grateful, knowing they had reached not an ending, but the beginning of everything that mattered. End of Millionaire in Love.